Canada likes to think of itself as a significant state. We need to step up our resourcing and step up our commitments to be able to do all the things ultimately that Canadians expect of their government and that which our government purports to want to do on our behalf.
Welcome to the latest installment of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. For this rendition, we spoke with Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Victoria and NAADSN Network co-lead Dr. Will Greaves. We spoke about the unique security challenges climate change poses to both northern Indigenous communities and the Arctic itself. Greaves addresses environmental changes occurring in the Arctic as a result of climate change, the impact of the changing environment on Indigenous cultural knowledge, challenges posed to northern communities, the need to better integrate Inuit voices into agenda setting and decision-making regarding security and defense matters, as well as how Canada can proactively address boundary issues in the Arctic. Greaves' research on Arctic Indigenous peoples, security, and climate change has included both textual and documentary analysis, and primary fieldwork consisting of interviews and participant observation with Indigenous leaders and organizations in Canada and Norway. We hope you enjoyed this episode. To read the full transcript, you can go to our website at cdainstitute.ca.
Will, thanks again for joining us today for what I think will be an important discussion about the security of Indigenous and Northern communities. I'd like to start off by asking you what some of the unique or specific impacts of climate change are on Arctic and Northern Indigenous communities.
There are four impacts of climate change that come to mind as fairly specific or somewhat unique to the Arctic region. The first of them are physical changes to unique Arctic ecosystems. So there are simply physical features of the Arctic environment that are particularly susceptible to climate change, which is also, of course, happening more quickly and acutely in the Arctic. And so it's just more visible and more transformative in the Arctic region than it would be elsewhere. A couple of examples of those unique changes would include the loss of sea ice, the melting of glaciers, and the thawing of permafrost, all three of which are clearly, fundamental to the ecological systems around them. Second, and related to the ecosystem changes themselves, what we see is a lot of loss of animal habitat and changes or disruptions towards migratory routes. So this directly affects access to traditional food sources, which of course then affects the health and nutrition of Northerners, particularly Indigenous Northerners, who still rely on what are often called country foods for a large part of their nutritional intake. This affects various species, but notable ones in the North American Arctic context include caribou, seals, and fish species, all of which have been significantly disrupted as a result of environmental changes. Those changes to the land, particularly permafrost thaw, loss of sea ice, coastal erosion, also compound existing challenges related to limited infrastructure or critical failures of existing infrastructure in many communities. And so we see the way in which this makes existing challenges even harder to address than they already are. One obvious example, I think, is the desperate need for housing in many northern communities is made even more difficult to address because of the already very high cost of housing being made more expensive by the need to make that new housing resilient in the face of climate impacts coming, and the fact that it needs to be built on thawing permafrost, which is inherently unstable. So it just really, really multiplies the cost of the construction itself. And that's before we get to the fact that a lot of northern communities are actually located in disadvantageous places. That is to say that those communities were sited where they are normally not because of the desires of the people who live there, but because of other motivations of the government of Canada or the Canadian Armed Forces, which means that the rationale that led to them being there in the first place has changed, but the communities obviously still exist where they do, which is very often on floodplains, which is very often in like kind of climate vulnerable regions, which just creates a structural problem, of course. In addition to housing, we also see a similar problem, I think, with availability of fresh water supplies, which can be compromised by these environmental changes. So not only do kind of higher temperatures and changing weather patterns affect the availability of fresh water, of groundwater systems that exist, but in some places like Iqaluit, less than a year ago, we saw how thawing permafrost and changes to the ground can crack old fuel tanks or pipelines, and in that case led to the contamination of the freshwater supply for the entire municipality of Iqaluit. Likewise, these issues obviously overlap and intersect with each other in various ways. The loss of access to high quality country foods through hunting and fishing increases the reliance of people on expensive and often highly processed store-bought foods, which thus contributes to chronic disease and poor health among many Northerners, including children. And so we see how this wheel really keeps turning as this terrible inertia where climate impacts exacerbate a lot of existing challenges. The fourth point, and the final one, but one that's specifically relevant to Indigenous peoples living in the North, because it pertains to the cultural and social practices, as well as the bodies of knowledge which they possess, that are intimately connected to the land and are based on a deep understanding of the Arctic environment. So environmental changes in the Arctic are also cultural changes that contribute to significant social challenges and dislocation for northern communities, right? So this includes the effects on transportation and mobility due to the loss of sea ice and thawing permafrost, unstable and unpredictable winter roads. All of those factors make communities more isolated. It makes it harder for people to travel, to visit their relatives, to visit friends, to access different kinds of opportunities, because it becomes less safe, quite literally, to leave their community and travel in ways that they have been accustomed to doing. It means that individuals, and often very experienced individuals who do go out on the land, often for hunting, fishing, and traveling, are putting themselves at higher risk. And we're seeing higher mortality rates, unfortunate, fatalities, tragic accidents of people who have experience and knowledge, but are finding themselves in an environment that's no longer really consistent with the knowledge that they have. And consequently, accidents are increasingly common, and people die as a result. And then their death is not only a personal tragedy, but they are knowledge holders and people who are really important as repositories of these cultural bodies of information. So we see again the way in which that process kind of is self-perpetuating and self-fulfilling. Taken collectively, these changes mean that the body of traditional Indigenous knowledge that's been developed over many centuries is actually less useful and applicable than it once was, because it no longer accurately reflects some aspects of the natural environment. So this in turn contributes to the loss of Indigenous cultural knowledge and exacerbates many of the harms of the colonial period and many of the challenges and disruptions and difficulty associating with Indigenous ways that people deal with today.
It has been acknowledged that Inuit have considerable knowledge pertaining to security that may be applicable in a range of different areas. Policymakers often don't understand this knowledge and cannot tap into it for security purposes. How can this gap be bridged, and how can we foster the capacity to better incorporate Inuit voices into decision-making and agenda setting regarding Canada's defense and security?
I think the answer is straightforward to give, but obviously much harder to put into practice. And so the short answer, which is pretty straightforward, is that Inuit need to be at the table when these decisions are made as full partners in government decisions affecting their territories. This is something that has obviously not been the historical norm, but I do think is something of a silver lining in that we've seen significant progress made in recent years. Notably, for example, the establishment of something called the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, which links representatives of the major Inuit organizations with representatives of the Crown, of the federal government, in this formal committee of government, which meets 3 times per year, one of those meetings at least being chaired by the Prime Minister himself. So a very, very high-level forum for Inuit to engage directly with their federal counterparts and ensure that their concerns, that their voices are heard, and that there's a formal structure that permits that to happen. I think it also means that there are aspects of security that are related to community safety and to emergency response, which can benefit from leaning on the knowledge and experience of the Canadian Rangers, for example, who exist in many northern communities and who are mostly Indigenous in the Arctic. And so what we see here are active and experienced community members who are organized into this kind of quasi-militia structure under the auspices of the Canadian Armed Forces, not to engage in conventional defense of the North, that's not the Rangers' role, but to provide a really valuable suite of other services that serves multiple purposes at once, right? It keeps people on the land, it provides a source of income to community members, it allows opportunities to maintain and uphold that kind of traditional knowledge and land-based knowledge, to pass it on to others, by doing, you're on the land together, so you're sharing what you know, and other people can learn in that way, while also providing really critical functions in terms of checking up on communities that may have been isolated because of an extreme weather event or some kind of critical infrastructure failure, providing, as we saw in the pandemic context, right? Sometimes providing emergency relief, food supplies, water supplies, medicine being brought by dog sled, because that might be the fastest way to actually get it from one community to another. Dog sled or snow machine, there's other kinds of options. In terms of this question of, how to incorporate Inuit voices, I think one of the key things that needs to be prioritized is ensuring that government policies in the areas of security and defense, and here I'm speaking specifically of federal government policies, don't cause or exacerbate harms for Inuit and other Indigenous peoples. This has too often been the case in the past. We're well aware of this. There's lots of, really clear historical instances of this. But I think that we should consider that to be intolerable in our current era and in our context of truth and reconciliation. The truth requires honest acknowledgement of the past harms that have been committed on Inuit and other Indigenous peoples in the name of the security and defense of Canada. And reconciliation going forward requires that the full participation of Inuit and other Indigenous peoples is facilitated and embraced to ensure that it doesn't happen again. In short, I think when it comes to security and defense policymaking, better is possible. And we've seen important progress, notably earlier this year. We saw an instance of this kind of, I think, much more balanced, much more inclusive approach to defense policymaking with the announcement in June of upgrades to the North Warning System, the radar system across northern Canada, which prioritized contracting Inuit-owned businesses to do the actual work, and which awarded the first tranche of federal government funding of $500 million, to Inuit-owned businesses. And that's a way of ensuring that the activities that the government of Canada is engaging in the interest of its own territorial defense in northern Canada is also doing double duty in terms of funneling economic activity and economic benefits to the Inuit communities that are most directly implicated in that project.
How do northern Indigenous communities conceive of security in the Arctic? And to what extent does the federal government's policies or interests in the region conflict with the interests or security concerns of Indigenous communities there?
It's a question that's been at the center of a lot of the research that I've done. I think the first thing that I would want to note is that based on the primary research that I've done and based on my own kind of reading of the academic work in this field, I don't think there's a single either northern conception of what security means or a single Indigenous conception of what security means. And we should be a little bit cautious around essentializing both of those categories as though they had a kind of natural consensus or that they were automatically, in agreement about these questions and that agreement stands in opposition to the Canadian state. I don't think that's really the case. As with any complex societies across northern Canada, we see a lot of variation in political opinion, in political leanings, in ideologies, and that manifests in countless ways, but including in terms of security and defense. That said, I think we can also look at the empirical record, which I've done in the context of Inuit peoples in northern Canada over the last number of decades, to see how it is that the organizations that represent Inuit in a formal political sense, this would include the government of Nunavut, but also the Inuit land claims organizations, the self-governing Inuit regions, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which represents Inuit at the Arctic Council, and also just the role, I think, of high-profile and important Inuit leaders like Her Excellency Mary Simon or Sila-Wat Cloutier or these other individual Inuk who have been really, really prominent and high-profile in terms of articulating and expressing views on behalf of their people and their communities. When we look at how that body of different Inuit entities and groups and decision makers has expressed the meaning of security, what we actually see, I think, is a pretty clear distinction from what are conventionally understood or as state-centric or military-centric accounts of security. Since the 1980s, at least, but with some precedents going back to the 1970s and earlier, what we've seen is a pretty consistent framing of security for Inuit, focusing not on conventional military defense of the Canadian state, not on any of the things we might be familiar with from a national security perspective, but really stressing the security and well-being of their communities and the systems that their communities rely upon. So this comes full circle, though, to what we were discussing earlier in this conversation, because Inuit were responding to harms which had been inflicted upon them because of these policies, notably the construction of the distant early warning line, that earlier radar system in northern Canada, that caused all kinds of disruption and damage to Inuit communities. They damaged the land through the construction process. When various sites were decommissioned, they had contaminated materials, pollutants that were just abandoned at those construction sites, those former radar sites, which leached into the water, which leached into the soil, which poisoned the surrounding environments. which of course is often where Inuit people who had worked to build those sites had then settled and built their communities. So you really saw this terrible dynamic where Inuit had physically provided labor to build infrastructure to defend Canada and by extension the rest of North America, only to then be the recipients of all of these harms, economic, ecological, cultural harms associated with the very thing that they had been, tasked to build. And so in the 1980s, what we saw was the beginning of this discourse that said that security for Indigenous peoples looks different than security for the state and requires different kinds of interventions, different kinds of focus, precisely because it's the military defense of the state that was causing all these insecurities for Indigenous peoples. And so this is something which was at first fairly marginal and had difficulty, I think, being taken seriously until after the Cold War ended. But in the 1990s, when the military threats to North America and the Canadian Arctic had obviously receded very significantly, there was room to kind of highlight these other issues and for Inuit to essentially put up their hand and say, listen, that security threat over there that you were worried about may have gone away. But now maybe can we talk about all these other things that are threatening me and my health and my children and my community and our way of life, and the bonds that hold us together as a people. And because of the increasing sophistication of Inuit political organization, because of the very effective ways in which Inuit organize themselves into these kind of collective institutional groups to advocate for themselves, to achieve self-determination through the creation of the Nunavut territory, increasing collaboration between Inuit across borders, all of those things strengthened the legitimacy and the capacity of Inuit people to essentially speak security, to use the language and vocabulary of security at a very high level of government and international cooperation, but to talk about different things and to talk about different types of issues than the military defense establishment had previously done. And so in this sense, an argument that I've made a number of times in print is that Inuit in Canada have been so-called securitizing actors, that they have, like other actors in our society do, attempted to get government to respond to a particular conception of what security means that they hold and that they were expressing publicly. The flip side is that I don't think we actually saw those securitizing moves, those attempts to construct a different meaning of security, really succeed in the sense of having the government of Canada accept them and implement them into policy. If we had seen success of those Inuit securitizing moves, which really centrally, in my analysis, stress the importance of the Arctic environment and protecting the Arctic environment against its degradation and pollution and climate change. Also protecting Inuit traditional knowledge and cultural practices, and then thirdly, protecting Inuit autonomy and self-determination within the context of Canada as well. Those are the three things that Inuit have identified as the sources of security for them and the things that they would want to see secured. And so they've been securitizing actors, but I don't think we can be as positive about the success of those efforts at securitization simply because Canadian policy over the last 30 plus years would look very different if they had succeeded. So they've attempted to engage in that kind of securitizing discourse, but with, I think, a pretty uneven record of success because of the broader reluctance of the Canadian government and other institutions in Canada to reorient their understandings of what security means to be aligned with the ones that Inuit were expressing.
In the current Arctic security context, what opportunities exist for Canada to exercise leadership and enhance its national interest, particularly regarding boundary issues? What would a proactive policy look like when it comes to addressing boundary issues?
Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, or I should say its renewed invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, Arctic cooperation has been one of the major casualties of that war. And I think will remain so for the foreseeable future. So we're unfortunately in a context now where there is no functioning pan-Arctic political infrastructure. The Arctic Council is effectively, forgive the pun, on ice until some resolution to the war in Ukraine, which means that we functionally have a partitioned Arctic. We have an Arctic that's partitioned roughly into two halves. One half are the 7 Western capitalist democratic Arctic states in North America and Europe, and the other is the Russian Federation, which However we may feel about their aggressive and illegal behaviors elsewhere in the world, Russia is legitimately and appropriately an Arctic state and an Arctic power. Half of the Arctic is Russia's territory by right under international law. And so that just creates a very challenging context for Arctic cooperation for the foreseeable future. I think the silver linings to that, though, are that there is a real incentive, therefore, to essentially get our own house in order amongst those Arctic 7, the 7 Western Arctic allies. Because with respect to Arctic boundary disputes, most of those disputes actually exist amongst the Arctic allies, right? They don't actually implicate Russia particularly directly. And here I'm not referring to the process of determining the extended continental shelves in the Arctic Ocean, where there is overlap between the areas claimed by Russia and various other Arctic states, but rather bilateral boundary disputes that exist elsewhere in the Arctic. But as I say, primarily exist between allies. So Canada is particularly notorious in this sense, having had longstanding border disputes on the one hand with our Greenlandic Danish neighbors in the east over Hans Island, and then in the Beaufort Sea region in the Western North American Arctic with the United States. The really good news there is that earlier this year, Canada and Denmark have finally resolved the Hans Island dispute, this very, very silly diplomatic irritant that was of no particular national importance, but was symbolically significant, but which flared up in an unhelpful way and produced at least the perception of tensions between very closely aligned and friendly states such as Canada and Denmark. And so to have that issue resolved, I think is only to the good, is a really positive step. And my hope would be that that provides a kind of impetus or some wind in the sails behind trying to engage in a negotiated bilateral process with the United States in the Beaufort region, where what we have is a disputed maritime boundary in the Beaufort Sea based on differing interpretations of this nearly 200-year-old treaty, a treaty that was signed by neither the United States nor Canada, incidentally. It's a treaty that was signed between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. And so we're just kind of living with some aspect of this colonial and imperial legacy that still really characterizes a lot of issues in the Arctic. But if Canada and Denmark can peacefully negotiate a resolution to the Hans Island dispute, I think that's a step towards being able to negotiate the more complex and probably divisive disagreement with the United States. And if we manage to do that, or perhaps even if we don't manage to do that, the other issue that Canada, I think, would be very well served, which isn't strictly a boundary issue, but it does pertain to the legal status and the hotly contested nature of the Northwest Passage. And so here, Canada has a legal disagreement with almost every other country in the world. Canada asserts the Northwest Passage are Canadian internal waters, which means not that Canada wants to prohibit other vessels from traveling through those waters, but that Canada wants to be able to control and exercise a very high level of control over which vessels are able to traverse through the high Arctic archipelago. The problem is that nobody agrees with our argument. The problem is that no other countries support Canada's legal position here. And I think that in this context of working within the Arctic 7, there's a real opportunity to try to expand the regime that Canada already has in place with the United States, which has existed since 1988. It's called the Northwest Passage Agreement. And it effectively is an agreement to disagree. It's an agreement that says Canada and the United States disagree on the underlying legal question here, but we need to cooperate. We're friendly states. So what's an acceptable workaround that we can propose that all parties can live with? And that agreement sketches out a framework whereby the United States agrees that it will always ask for Canadian permission before any of its vessels enter the Northwest Passage, and Canada guarantees that it will always honor such a request when it gets made. So neither country has to concede their initial point, but it allows for American vessels to travel the Northwest Passage in a way that the Canadian government doesn't interpret as threatening to our own legal claims. It's an ambitious goal, and I'm fully aware of that, but I think there's an opportunity to try to multilateralize that Northwest Passage Agreement amongst the other Arctic 7 states. And if Canada was able to do that, was able to get these other close NATO allies, European and North American NATO allies, to sign on to that framework, then that would provide a very robust legal basis, I think, for the peaceful, cooperative use of the Northwest Passage that preserves Canada's claims and the regulatory framework around that, while allowing a transparent regime for other states' vessels to access the region. And I think that would be a really productive and valuable policy. and one that also has a huge opportunity to engage the Indigenous communities and the representatives of the Inuit governments in the region at the table. Because ultimately, when we're talking about the Northwest Passage, those are waters that go through Nunavut, and those are waters that go through the Northwest Territories. And so it would be appropriate for both of those territorial governments to be involved in those negotiations. But likewise, the Greenlandic government, right? The eastern terminus of the Northwest Passage always puts you out into Greenlandic waters, to bring Greenlandic Inuit to the table with Canadian Inuit, with representatives of the Northwest Territories, as well as, of course, representatives of the Government of Canada, would provide a really robust, multilateral, but also within the Canadian context, federalized approach to negotiating a resolution to a complex, outstanding issue. While our attention has rightly been focused on Russia, has rightly been focused on the war in Ukraine, and clearly, the consequences of that conflict are most urgent in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine itself, where people are being directly affected. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the world didn't stop because of that war, and these other challenges, these other realities, notably climate change itself, continue to advance. And so the fact that we're not paying attention to them isn't relevant to the impacts that they're having upon us and the impacts that they're having on our present and future security. And so I think that we really need to develop more capacity so that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, because at the same time that we're participating in this international coalition to defend Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and try to contain Russian aggression, climate change is happening. Climate change is upon us, and we need to be able to respond in a really focused, long-term way to the challenges that climate change presents, both from an adaptation and a mitigation side, while doing these other things in the world as crises and challenges emerge. That's what significant states, are required to do, and Canada likes to think of itself as a significant state. We need to step up our resourcing and step up our commitments to be able to do all the things ultimately that Canadians expect of their government, and that which our government purports to want to do on our behalf.